Are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Count it down. All right, in three, two, one. Hello, Sophie Wade. Great to see you today.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm terrific, and I'm so excited for this conversation. I've been digging into your media library, and it is quite extensive, like 90 episodes, I think, on the podcast, 2 books, 5 LinkedIn learning classes, a couple little intro videos. You have been one busy lady keeping track of this whole future of work thing.
Trying this, it keeps moving, so I got to keep moving with it. I mean, it doesn't slow down, as we know, so it keeps me busy.
Right. Well, it's just kind of serendipitous, right? Your first episode I noticed on the podcast was February 27th, 2020, literally not even 2 weeks before the shutdown. You were doing the Flex network back in 2011, so you're a little bit ahead of the curve there. But wow, what a difference when suddenly, and there's a lot of kind of future of work advocates like Kate Lister and Adrienne Rowe
Mhm.
who've been fighting this battle for a long time. And then suddenly it's like the market came to you in not the greatest of circumstance, but certainly one you could never have anticipated.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I started in this space in 2011 when it was for my kids. I was, coming out of a long standing job, which I'd always had full-time jobs wherever I was working, startup or a big company. And then suddenly with technology was looking at this thing called, workplace flexibility and what that could be beneficial for all types of people. And I really thought, well, yes, obviously women will benefit, but everybody will benefit. And of course, then fast forward many years to the pandemic. And yes, just was launching my podcast in February 2020. And then, yeah, then everything shut down, and many more people were therefore available to do interviews with
Right.
me. So that was
Yeah, you
nice.
didn't have to travel. It certainly makes things a lot interesting. I was in the events business, and you had to schlep the gear and get there, and scheduling, is such a nightmare. And then we transitioned the company to Zoom calls basically on demand, and it's so much easier. And then once it got normalized, it just makes the whole world suddenly available to you without necessarily having to get on that plane. But you just got back from an exciting conference, so let's fast forward to today. I think you just got back from Web Summit. So what were some of the things going on as we fast forward to the end of 2023, which is kind of hard to imagine.
Yes, well, what was really interesting, well, the particular presentations that I was really keen to look at were about AI, and not just, I mean, any of these conferences, I'm not just listening to the presentation, I'm listening to the questions that people ask and the conversations that people are sort of having off, away from walking around the halls, and with 60, 70,000 people, whatever Web Summit is, and in the environs of Lisbon, which is a fabulous environment to be circulating in. And there's so much going on there. It was really interesting to me, one, the vibe, two, the excitement about, because there's a lot of pitch summits, it's a lot of startups and ventures, and they're, pitching competitions, and obviously endless new startups focused on AI. So that was what was really fascinating to me to see. And I watched a whole bunch of pitches. Each person at one point had like 2 minutes to give their pitch. And it really struck me how much everything that we're going to be doing is changing a bit to, from a small amount to a large amount, but everything. And augmenting what we're doing. There was one guy who was presenting about how how extraordinary some of the hallucinations are. I mean, I understand that they're between 10 and 20%, but some of them are really, really quite drastic and could be life-changing or game-changing. So, the challenge that I was sort of very interested in when we're sort of thinking about this, Jeff, is really what does the truth mean? If we think about observer-based reality, how are we going to discern what truth is and what truth means and what facts are? Facts are often interpretable, right?
Right, right. Oh, they're absolutely interpretable, right? Is 60 old or young? Well, ask an 8-year-old or ask an 80-year-old. You're going to get two very different answers, right? And they're both completely correct. I think the deep fakes thing is fascinating and scary. And, even now I continue to be impressed at kind of the creativity and the sophistication of some of the phishing techniques. And, as they
Right.
kind of evolve their language. And then you think once they have almost perfect information that it's, your child, and they're on, vacation in Southern California, and they're going to Disneyland, and they send you a note from Disneyland in their voice, in their head, with Mickey Mouse in the
Mm.
background saying they need an extra $100 because somebody just, stole their wallet or whatever it is. I think it's going to be really challenging. It's definitely going to be difficult.
Yes, and this is what's sort of fascinating to me because it goes to the core of the creation. I mean, we are needing to be, I mean, just as you went, you took your show from, being in a studio, having everybody else do things for you, and you had your particular role, then you take it home during the pandemic and you're needing to do a lot more, and the sophistication of your setup, just as just all the different recommendations you were giving me, and I'm trying to up my setup as well. So thank you very much for that, Jeff. We are all becoming that much more, we're being up-leveled, we're being upskilled in terms of how much more we can do individually. And as we're creating more content, and as we're becoming, that's the role that each one is putting ourselves sort of at the center of the node, and what we're creating and doing with that, whether it's real or fake, or in our voice, or with our own opinion on it, it really changes how we each need to be thinking about what we're putting out there, what, the lens that we're, the opinion that we're putting behind it, and how we're communicating with other people, and what their backgrounds are, and how they're going to be sort of receiving it. I mean, it really changes the dynamics of all these different interactions, whether it's sort of broadcast, or one-to-one, or one-to-many.
Yeah. And you've got your empathy book there over your shoulder, and I know you've
Oh.
written about it and you speak about it, and empathy is ultimately, as you know better than I, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and feeling what they feel. And it seems like that, there's some potential conflict with being your whole self and bringing your opinions to work and risk taking at the same time. You've got kind of cancel culture, and there's kind of landmines. It's easy to step, either accidentally, intentionally, or when the context changes, if something's taken out of context. And it's this really kind of interesting time where you want to be forthright and be the whole self, and we want to value the whole self. At the same time, people have disagreements, and there are things that can get really hot really, really fast. So I think the communication challenges are not simple these days, and the stuff lasts forever.
Yes. And I think there's a difference. There's nuance to this, right? And this is where we have to get the balance right. So coming to work within a sort of two-dimensional cutout model, and we're kind of like, it's all business and we're not really showing our emotions, to the full everything that Sophie Wade is, goodness very God forbid. There's a person that I'm showing here, which is different than I show my kids, or that I might with, some other family members or friends. We're not showing, we might be our full self, but it's not every single aspect of ourselves. So we're being much more real, and much more, there's sort of more dimension to it, with sort of three-dimensional people, but we're not necessarily showing every single, wart and quirk. So I think that's where the empathy comes in, because it's sort of like, empaths can get railroaded. The point is not to let the other person have everything that they want, or you have everything they want when you can manipulate them. It's really trying to get that balance of needs, that balance of understanding. What is it not appropriate for me to necessarily be talking about? And it could be just, something that's happened to you, or something that happened to one of your family members, or your dog. So I don't want to bring up my dog because that might remind, there are things that we just need to be thoughtful about. But it doesn't mean that we're being fake, or being, untrue, and being superficial. So I think it's that learning that we need to bring in. We do that in our personal lives all the time. We just haven't been as three-dimensional in the past as we are needing to be now, because we're also needing to sort of lean into the new dynamic, the new interactions that we have, which we need to be that much more capable of working closely together under pressure, under stress, trying to get the best ideas. I'm sure the dynamics, well, I'm curious, how did you find the dynamics change from being in a studio, having done so many in studio sessions, to then using a different channel where you were separated. There was still, a lot of technology involved, but how did the different channels and mediums change that experience for you?
I think the thing that's underrated in live is the theater of the presence. And we focused a
Mm.
lot on the theater of the presence. I used to tease my photographers that the whole thing was actually just a setup to get a great photo of the guests looking good because it was properly lit and there was a active background and they were dressed and prepared and they were engaged in the moment. And so you get a great photograph, and nothing used to make me happier than when people would use those photographs for their LinkedIn profiles and stuff. So I think it's the theater and the you got to be much more intentional in picking up on clues. You got to really pay close attention to what's going on,
Right.
which is much harder, when you don't have those physical clues. The benefit though is you can reach out and touch people so much easier. There's is every coin has two sides. On one hand, it's easy for people to cancel if they're not physically present in that place and it's part of their conference schedule. Maybe it's harder for them to context switch. To me, that one of the biggest challenges for people in these contexts is to take 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 5 minutes to just, wash your face or get up and walk around your desk or get a breath of fresh air or fresh cup of coffee, just to context switch and get your mind right. And a lot of people don't do that well. And that's maybe harder to do in a remote location
I need
because
to
it's
get a
easier to back
dog.
stuff
I have
up.
to get up all
Yeah.
I have to get up all the time and walk my dogs. And that always gives me that sort of ability to switch it up, change mode, and then sit back down, maybe with a cup of coffee or a tea or something like that. But it really, and therefore I'm more purposeful about what I do when I then sit down again. Because am I then starting something that's mentally different, or is it going to be the same type of thing? And again, that will be the next phase. It's sort of interesting how some of those break times can really help us design our work days differently. How are you finding that?
Yeah, and in fact, I reboot often. I reboot my whole machine and just kind of restart everything when I
Oh,
complete a project or not even a project, a post or whatever, just to get a refresh of the mind and close all the tabs and close all the windows to start fresh. Because there's so many, you can distract yourself pretty easy by, say, getting ready for this and pulling up all your podcasts and pulling up your LinkedIn learnings and, pulling up your books. And suddenly, next thing you know, you've got all this stuff open. So I actually reboot the whole thing many times a day instead of having 87,000 tabs open, which I know some of my fellow coworkers do.
oh no, I'm absolutely guilty of that. Well, not even guilty of that. That is what I do.
Right.
I like it like that. And I put bookmarks in already, but I like to have them there and I go between them.
Well,
So
I have six
that's not
screens.
how
That's how I do
people.
it. I literally have more screens than you can count in
Oh,
front
well,
of
there you
me.
go.
So that's how I do it.
Hey.
There you go. The other piece you cover a lot is multi-generational, right? And people are working longer and kids are coming in. So we've got this situation where we've got multi-generational people. And the thing to me, and talk about empathy and trying to put yourself in someone's shoes, the part that illustrates to me how difficult that is for people like you and me, who've been around a little bit longer than the young people, is this great Stanford study that came out on online dating and married couples. And, pre 1984, thereabouts is about when I graduated from college, was, met my wife shortly thereafter. There was no internet. There was no online dating. So how you met your spouse was zero, and all the rest were work, a bar, friends, church, family, blah, blah, blah. Now
Right.
it's over 50%. So most people met their spouse via a digital interaction that didn't exist when their boss or their boss's bosses met their spouse. And to me, I just thought that was so illustrative of how the world has changed and why it's so difficult to understand something that's now a core to how people meet their spouse that didn't exist when I was doing the same thing.
Yes, and for me, when I sort of think about some of the things that are associated with that, is this differentiation between real and virtual, and sort of in real life. I don't think of in person as being necessarily in real life, because we're in real life, but
Right.
we're not in the same place. And so this, how we even define some of these things like real and not real, and or real and virtual, like there's so many things that we need to be thinking and just, either tweaking or changing completely. We have a very old phrase, which was the camera never lies. That could not be more untrue now, almost. So, there are many things that we really need to be rebooting, changing, and really thinking what suits, what's appropriate now, and I was going to say what's true now. That's, but and some of these things are harder to define than others, but it is a moment, I think, that we really need to be thinking much more thoughtfully about these things. Again, when we get to AI and deep fakes and all the and hallucinations, what responsibility it puts on every single one of us to try and work out what is true, what is real, and how we're interacting with whomever we're interacting with, of whatever generation. Because yes, they're the way somebody who is 17, 18, 19, 20, how the facility with which they use technology and how they're sort of interacting with it, and somebody who is much older, it's a very different interaction, very different comfort level.
Right, right. And how do you see development? That's the other bit. You talk a lot about development, employee development, personal development. And, I first job out of school, worked at Macy's, had a management program. I just checked in on your very first episode. That guest, I think, said he worked at Enterprise, which hired more college grads than any other place, right? And there were these formal programs that existed, and they did have to change very often, very quickly, because things weren't changing that quickly. And so, they were kind of these big established things. In a world of skills-based learning, and, now college is so expensive, how do you see development changing? And also when we have the whole world potentially at our fingertips and our phone, versus, kind of the ways when we were getting started in our careers, and more the I don't want to say traditional, but the older ways of career development. Because it's Jennifer Tejada, one of my favorite CEOs, all she ever talks about is the great learning she got at Procter & Gamble and some of these old formal training programs that just don't exist anymore.
Well, some of them do. I mean, the ones, to my understanding, the ones that still exist, these rotational programs, which are very powerful. And I'm trying to remember who I interviewed who was talking about the rotational programs. I think Pepsi does them still, Unilever and some of the banks do
So
them.
there's still a few out there.
People yes, and where companies can do that very deliberately, even if the company is small and doesn't have huge divisions that you can actually rotate people through, it's a very powerful way for let's say the youngest generation to come in and experience different areas of the organization. And it also therefore facilitates talent mobility. Now, moving within an organization, because we don't typically have these linear sort of, lots and lots of incremental steps up the ladder, that doesn't exist anymore, because particularly our companies are much flatter. Therefore, it is much harder to move around the organization because it hasn't been set up like that. And what that means, therefore, is that it's easier for, and the data from LinkedIn from 2022 was that only 20% of Gen Zs feel that their boss or their company supports their next career move, their next career progression. So it's easier for them to leave. So what we need to be doing is really facilitating. I mean, it's just still early days in terms of talent mobility within large organizations and internal talent marketplaces. So if instead you brought people in and had already scheduled for them to be working in different areas, that's going to help them connect, help them network within the organization, find out what they're good at. You can find out what this person is good at too, or what they like or what they're interested in, and you get a much more well-rounded employee. So I think that's one of the ways. So I love the fact that you brought that up, because that is something that we can use that as a kind of old model, but really use that to great advantage these days. And my next podcast episode, a guy called Paul Wolf had an amazing idea that he came up with in terms of you and I think when we last chatted, we were talking about the fact that some people just aren't great managers, right? So,
Right.
apparently, supposedly 10% of people are really good managers. And maybe I'm not quite sure what percentage it is. Somebody told me it's very low. I don't want to necessarily believe
Seems
that.
low to me.
But yeah, it's like,
I'm
so,
just going
so,
a
but
normal distribution
with,
curve, you know.
well, fair enough. So if somebody isn't a great manager and they love doing what they're doing, there are a number of people in the technology area where they are allowed to sort of be single contributors and rise up, but a single pathway, but not necessarily have to manage people. So how about in non-technology areas doing the same type of thing? So there is a pathway, not for everybody, but in some areas where people can move up, get promoted, earn more money, better title, whatever it might be, but not have to manage people. Now, that's really interesting because we have all these new types of career pathways. We can go horizontally, we can go diagonally. That allows for some people to excel, not have to be doing something that they really don't want to do. They love what they were doing, and they got promoted as a result, and then suddenly they're not doing what they enjoy doing or are good at anymore. So I think we can really start rethinking how we are moving people around, the skills that they need to acquire, how we're going to do that. There are, all types of ways that people can both take it on themselves and importantly be trained by their organization. So I think there are lots of different elements to this that are going to be fulfilled in different ways.
Yeah, a lot of those out here in tech, fellows and ways that you can be a pretty senior individual contributor without managing people. I think that's a really smart thing. But I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the role of the one-on-one. You've talked about it some in some of your podcasts, and getting to know your people better. I had Dave Montez on. He spends 2.5 hours a day plus in one-on-ones with his people, and he just really manages by getting to know people. Wonder if you can share, some of your research and your workshops about, this importance of really getting to know individuals and how that actually increases their productivity, their retention, the quality of the employee.
Sure. Well, if let's just say you were working for me, I need to have a better understanding of who you are, when you work best, what really drives you, what kind of projects you're really excited by. And that comes from lots of interactions, from me hearing you finish up a project. You're like, oh my God, that was great. I really love that. I'm like, okay, so you like that type of project. The next project kind of like, yeah, okay, but I need to pay attention to that. I need to actually notice and maybe write it down. And then days, maybe you're horrible in the morning, or not horrible, but you need a cup of coffee. Otherwise, there's no point talking to you. That's a well, actually, you get up early, but you're on the West Coast. So I need to be thinking about that. Like, what time zone is he in and when's he going to have his coffee? These are the things that help us actually sort of smooth the interactions, make sure that we can have the best, both a one-on-one, or if we're going to bring somebody else in, what is their particular sort of profile, or, what's their way of operating, the basic way of operating that is going to be, most effective, and then trying to understand when you find your flow. My best time for writing is sort of between 6 and probably 10 in the morning. And then I also have got a period at night where I know there's no other emails. I can really, focus and relax. And gosh, do I crash at like sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There's no point of me trying to do any writing then. I need to know, the more I can understand that for you and other people on my team, the more I can help you actually organize your time. Because we all need to be working these out for ourselves. And if I'm managing, a number of people, that's going to be helpful when I can sort that out together. And of course, we need to make compromises as a team. So it's not just, okay, well, Jeff is really not great in the morning, so we're just going to do everything, late morning or early afternoon, because that doesn't necessarily suit with other people who have different, times of flow and whatever, depending on the different tasks they are. So we really need to be sort of thinking about individual people and then how we're going to work best as a team. So that's where the sort of empathy is, as not being kind and nice. It's really about what is going to help each one of us be most effective, and then really supporting that. And that includes helping you be self-aware about what works for you. So, that is, that was one thing that the pandemic did help to understand being shut up at home all the time, that wasn't great. Okay, now going back to the office all the time, I can see that that's not going to be great either. So let me try and work out. So we've had some experience of both of those locations and maybe a third location, because actually I just don't have room at home to have a good workspace. I need to have a third space, and that's going to suit me best for particular types of work. So these are some of the things we've been finding out about ourselves when we've had more options to really try and understand, okay, now if I'm going to design my work in the most thoughtful and effective way possible, what's it going to look like? So I'm curious, I'm really interested in, we were talking before this about music and the idea of using music as a way of trying to understand the way forward, trying to understand the new ways that we're working, the new models that we're thinking about, the new ideas about content creation, and what are the ways that we can be leaning into that, or sort of understanding our roles. So I'd love to, you both post a lot about sort of AI, but you also, we were talking a lot about music. So I'd love
Right.
to hear some more of your thoughts about that in terms of how you draw on different types of content, and particularly music creation, in terms of understanding where we are and what's ahead.
Great. So there's kind of three legs to that stool. The first leg was a guy by the name of Bob Lefsetz, and I was introduced. It was called the Lefsetz newsletter, and it's just the old school newsletter. And I think I've been getting it for over 20 years. And he writes about the music industry. And I once had I don't know, we were pitching something to somebody from a music company, and I mentioned his name. They said that they had a jar in the middle of their table that if anybody mentioned Bob Lefsetz's name, they had to put money in the jar. So I was like, wow, so he must really be touching a nerve. And he writes about music. Well,
Okay.
what's interesting from the business point of view is music was one of the first things to get digitized, to move from the physical space in the form of an LP or a CD to get digitized. It got digitized in its distribution, where suddenly the lock that was contained by the record companies and the popular DJs was broken through things like Napster. Then you had change in the business model, where it kind of technology enabled, with Apple suddenly having 99 cents, their whole campaign, carry 1,000 songs in your pocket, which for those of us that used to carry cassettes, that was 90 minutes. And then you had Napster, which then suddenly it's given away on this peer-to-peer network. And then suddenly you have Spotify, which introduced, well, before that was Pandora, but you couldn't choose. So
Right.
it's been this really interesting, and he writes about it, way that the music business has changed. And then around that is everything from changing the business model to, do you make your money on the record and do the concerts to promote it, or do you make your money on the concerts and you create the record to promote your concerts, or is it just
Right.
merch? And so it's been a really interesting thing to keep track of and watch as digitization has hit other industries. The music industry was way out front and had a lot of early winners and losers, and continues to evolve. The second leg of that stool is really music, as in terms of trying to equate where music creativity comes from with business creativity and innovation. How do you create the conditions for people to discover things? And I think what's really driven me in doing some of my investigation is that there's no magic, right? It's just a lot of hard work. And in this area, I watch a lot of Rick Beato interviews, where he interviews a lot of musicians, and he's got a great one with Sting. And Sting just said, he says, to me, it's like fishing. You just got to go down to the river and put your hook in the water every day, and you may get something on Monday, you might not. You might get something on Tuesday, you might not, but you're not going to get anything on Thursday if you didn't go down and put your fish in. So this kind of blowing away the concept that it's magic. There's no magic. It's just hard
Right.
work. It's iteration, and some things will be a hit, and some things won't be. So then, really stealing from
Right.
Jack Conte from Patreon has a couple of great talks about great publishers, whether they're musicians or playwrights or authors, and you just don't know it's going to hit. So if you just don't worry about it, knowing that you can't over index on one particular piece of content, and that the flow is your friend. So just go with the flow. Some stuff will hit, some stuff won't. But what that won't hit is the thing that you think is gonna hit. So really don't worry about it. So really, it's just
Right.
about this constant flow of communication within the social channels to do that. And then the last thing for me, to your point, is how do you find your own flow state? How do you help yourself
Mm.
get in a place where you can create productive work, and like writing, or heads down 2 or 3 hours of dedicated time? And for me, the magic there is music. It's that find the right piece of music, and it changes, that gets you into a state where you can kind of get almost hypnotic, a little bit, and get into that flow state and just go. And you're there when you lose track of time. It is a very different place to go. So if you can help teach yourself how to get there, I think that helps a ton. And a big piece is turning off the distractions.
Yes, and it's so interesting because I see people who have music playing when they're with lyrics and they're working, and I simply cannot work under those kind of conditions. So, and some people are saying that that can be for extroverts who they need that buzz, and then they can really focus. So it was very interesting to me because I absolutely like classical music. I can do with like like some of the great on Spotify has sort of the sort of focus playlist, which I find helpful. So going to the business model aspect is very interesting to me because of where we are now and how things are evolving. And I watched the episode that you sent me from Rip Beato about Bjorn and the session studio, which is only now, after all this time, helping musical artists actually track all the licensing, all the residuals from their music, and it's fascinating to me, after all it has taken this long, to actually have some kind of mechanism to go down to an individual level. And I sort of think about that in terms of what that means. Really, I'm thinking about sort of employees and workers as being creators. And in fact, in France, if you're working for a company, depending on what you're doing, if you're really working on the company's business, that whatever IP you come up with belongs to the company. But if I think we're thinking of each person as being a creator, and there's the Hollywood strikes on that right now, should we be thinking about what we're doing in more of an individual way, and how we're contributing, as a musician, as an artist, as a one person employee within a team, within a company, who might be an employee, but also might well be a contract worker? Should we be really sort of stepping back and looking at all of this in a more fractional way, as though we're individual creators, like artists,
It
like
feels like it.
musicians?
It feels like we should. It feels like it for a bunch of different reasons. One is we know that the lifetime employment, at the single place is not happening anymore. I think in one of your podcasts you talked about plan for 5 careers, and in the same sentence you also said plan for multiple revenue streams. So as soon as you say plan for multiple revenue streams, the gig economy, that tells you that kind of the traditional single income stream is just not, it's either just not cutting it anymore. I mean, that's basically it. It's not cutting it anymore. First we went to 2 income families.
It's not, and it's not secure.
It's not secure, right? And that's the other thing I think a lot of the younger people are learning now, that have only lived in good times, that, bad times come every so often. And, you were around for 2008 and 2000, and, there were plenty more before that. So I do think it's interesting. I just had a podcast with Phil Simon, whose new book is called The 9 Tectonic Forces Changing the World, and fractional is one of his. So whether it's fractional, or you can somehow split your time, or it's really more skills dependent, you're a fractional CFO and you can actually split your time between a couple of,
right.
I think it's harder to describe what's the difference between fractional and a consultant. I think it's kind of slicing and dicing, but I think it's helpful if you can think that way, because to your point, the world is changing so fast that there is no stable rocks to stand on. Everybody's time in the Fortune 500 is getting shorter and shorter each and every year. I mean, look what's happening with the open AI. It's 1 calendar year, and it went from being nothing to everything, to suddenly the whole world is changing under its feet, like so fast. So I think if you can somehow find a way, and to your point, all the tools now are digital and relatively inexpensive, and you can potentially have access to some small slice of the 8 billion people in the world. I think it's a little bit more pressure. But if you think back to historical societies, everyone was kind of their own little solopreneur before the Industrial Revolution. So there's a little bit of a renaissance to that.
Exactly. Yes, and I think if we can think about it like that, it is going back. We just have much better tools, and they're getting, fantastic. We have amazing capabilities now. But the same thing still become true. It's not that, now there are more DJs, more people can have a DJ board. So, there definitely are a lot more DJs, but it's not that with more capabilities and more access to music, and that there are so many more musicians and artists, because it still takes that amazing song and, that particular voice or wherever it might be. What's interesting in some of the evolution of the music business to me, and I'm very interested to sort of think how you see that evolution in terms of what the record companies were doing. I interviewed J.R. Richards, and it was sort of interesting, the dynamics, which the artist had no control and no say and no transparency, and no ability to audit any, their the budgets and the incoming revenues and whatever that might be. And now we're getting to a place where we have a very different dynamics and an evolution where there is more transparency, I think, and very different dynamics about all the different types of revenue streams that musicians can generate and lean into. And he's been very interesting in how he's been exploring that and how he's connecting with his fans. So do you see some of these dynamics, in terms of the music industry, how much more that some of these may be ones that we see growing and using these examples in the workplace?
Well, the two things I wanted to respond to, one is the power of distribution, and and that kind of wanes and waxes. And before, back in the day, there was only one source of distribution for your music, and that was through the labels. And there was no other way to get your music out to people. And then the DJs had big influence on what hit the Billboard 100 and what was on the end cap at Tower Records. Now you have many forms of distribution. The difficulty, as you said, by the same token, so does everyone else. So now it's way more competitive, but at the same time, you do have your shot. And I think what's interesting is it still, I think, can reward artists who are authentic, and authenticity pays. And I think trying to play to the crowd, which I think you see a lot more pretenders trying to follow along, doesn't work. But you continue to have new people that kind of pop through and do that. The other thing I think that's so much different is the microsegmentation of consumption around whatever it is your interest is. I mean, there used to only be like 5 TV stations. If there was the 3 big ones, there was your local one, and there was your PBS here in the States. Right. I mean, now you have all these people that have built huge audiences around particular topics. I introduced you to 3 or 4 that I watch most every day. You had never heard of them. It happens all the time. So we're all listening to our own thing. And the other piece that's even crazier is there's a day you wake up and you figure out that everybody's Facebook feed is different, right? It's not this linear flow of people that you follow. Right. And we've all watched the Netflix Social Dilemma, right? It's what they think is going to keep you on platform. What's even more interesting is even as we walk down the street together, we're actually seeing different things, even though we're seeing the same things based on our own biases, based on what we're focused on, based on what we're distracted by. My wife and I can go to the farmer's market. We've been married for 30 years, come home together and have seen a completely different farmer's market. I mean, like literally seeing different booths, seeing different foods, noticing different things. It's like we didn't go to the same place. So once goes back to your kind of empathy, understand that everyone actually sees a different world, even if you're sitting next to one another at the same time. It's kind of wild.
It is kind of wild. And so, I think trying to understand some of the things that are the same, that are similar, that do connect us when so much is changing. Because I think, one of the things that was so powerful about the experience, as tragic and so many terrible things that happened during the pandemic, but we were connected. We were amazingly connected, and we all felt raw and vulnerable. And it allows us to both see into each other's homes, understanding the stress, the terrible situations that the frontline workers were in. But there was an amazing sense of connection. And I think trying to use some of that understanding that of now, as we understand how challenging people are all finding it. I mean, just watching the Rick Beato also with the guy from ABBA, and they're trying to like, what's AI going to do? We have a Hollywood strike. Like, what does AI mean there? We're all in the same boat trying to work out what is this going to do, and how is this going to change our lives and change our work, and how we're going to get paid, and what does this mean? So that is something that does unite us, and trying to sort of be both collaborative, sort of collaborating and trying to understand and sharing, and that comes down to also reliable sources of truth. If I'm sort of thinking about it, it's not only kind of going, oh, Jeff, thanks for these different, the newsletter, there was some great stuff about music there, and I learned a lot about different elements. At the same time, when I trust you, then, and you send me something, or you share some, a news article or some other stuff that you post, I'm going to trust it. I'm going to use you as a reliable source of my truth going forward. And these are going to become more and more relevant, sort of leaping into the sort of whole idea of hallucinations, where sometimes you're kind of like, oh, this is fantastic, and I can tell because I know enough about that area to know whether it's, whether it's true, and maybe there isn't, there aren't so many untruths in it that are sort of game changing, that are really important. It's just, but there are other areas where something can come back after a question and a prompt, which is absolutely and completely false and problematic if I were to believe that. So we need to have much stronger sort of trust networks that we can rely on, both at work and in our personal lives, in order to make sure that we're moving forward in the right direction when we're trying to sort of in a sort of very uncertain world where lots of things we sort of not quite sure which direction we're going in. And so that's actually comes full circle in a way to some of the conversations we talk about, like checking in, understanding, and having these conversations, these regular chats with people. There's so much course correcting. There's so much that we need to be connecting with people so that we can have those trust-based conversations to make sure we're moving forward step by step, incrementally in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the empathy is the key thing, and I think communication is the least valued aspect of management, of leadership, to be conscious in how you communicate, to listen actively, to validate that you heard what you think that you heard, because you probably didn't hear what you think. And I think so much now about mission and purpose, and making sure people understand what's the mission and the purpose, and do you tie, do they know how their role, their job, their contributions somehow tie through multiple steps back to this bigger thing, which I think you said is more important to young people than ever. So and you can't do it enough. You can't practice it enough. You can't say it enough. So I think that is a good thing, that the communication. I think one of your podcasts, you said, the young people, you can't just tell them just do it. That's not viable anymore, right? That doesn't really work. You're not in a military situation where it's life and death if you don't go right now.
Right. Well, I think it's also, there's such a different construct. Let's just say, with the 50s, 60s, not as much in the 70s, but I think a lot of people did think so. But if the organization is giving you a job and it's a job for life, then there's a sort of, that's the social contract. I do work for you, you pay me, and that's the sort of, I have security, and I will do some, probably really boring grunt work, and I might work late hours, but that's the dynamic. And then I get to retire at the end, and sort of, that's the full equation. Well, none of that exists anymore.
Right.
And so how am I going to trust this organization? What's going to persuade me to do the work that seems boring or endless or, pointless, whatever? Like, I need to have a reason, or I need to know why I'm doing this matters, because all the other elements that were might have persuaded me before that I was going to get a pension from this company, that there was, I would incrementally go up the ladder. That's not happening. There's none of those dynamics are there. Therefore, what the company's doing or how I'm connecting with it, so why I come in every single day, if there's no meaning for me in terms of what is ultimately going to get me in my life, then I need to it's so much more valuable really to be connected with something bigger than my particular life.
Right. I want to get your take on what there's so many little paradoxes. One is, this whole focus and shift, which I think is great, to basically create an environment for people to do their best work. So it's a very different kind of mindset versus telling them what to do. It's kind of creating this environment, creating the space for them to get in a flow state, to make the contributions in the area that they want. At the same token, again, we hear most of our best learning comes from difficult times. And getting through difficult moments. And those are the things, when you look back, it's often the things that were the most memorable, or the things that made the biggest impression, or the most lasting impression. Martin Mikos, the CEO of a Hacker One's, got a great line. He's like, yeah, we want to help people learn and put them in a good situation to learn, but the best way to learn not to touch a stove is to touch a stove. But, you can't put the kid's hand on the stove. At the same time, that that's the way they're going to learn. And you want to put people in challenging assignments to push them and cause them some angst, knowing that when they pop out the other side, and you may have more confidence in it than they do, that they're going to be good for it. At the same time, it's kind of in contrast to, coaching them up and putting them in the position where they're going to have the most chance to succeed. How do those things kind of get balanced out? As a manager, how do you think about kind of parsing those things to get the most and help people kind of grow?
So I would say that the bar has been raised so high right now that we are in that challenging situation almost every day in terms of what is in front of us. What are the things where you may laugh, but it's not that funny. But really, I think part of this is that there is so much uncertainty, that it's things are so unpredictable. And that was before ChatGPT came along and really sort of threw another spanner in the works. We were already moving at a pace. We were already having to adapt, and the nature of work had been changing. We're doing much more teamwork. We were, non-routine work had evolved, I think, 40-fold over the last 20 years. Collaborative work has gone up 50%. Over the last 20 years. So we've been working in very, very different ways, which has been challenging us, because if you're doing non-routine work, because automation had already been taking away some of the boring work, we already had more interesting, more challenging work to be doing. Now, step that up a bit. So when we're sort of thinking about how we're going to be organizing our work, or what we're going to be doing, we need to try and take the stress down and actually create a more an environment where people feel more safe and more able to take risks, because there is so much risk in the environment. There is so much stress in the environment already. So I think we have a little bit of a flip of that. We are all learning an extraordinary amount already right now. And yes, we do learn from the most challenging situations, those sort of epiphany moments. So I think what we can do is try to identify where there's sort of more stability in the ongoing changes that we are recognizing. There is, even though things keep changing, there is some direction and understanding, and we can get familiar with that, because human beings are not hugely comfortable with change all the time. And then try and anticipate where and how and what to focus on, which is going to create some of the bigger changes that are happening. One of the things we're asking people to do, I mean, there are some companies that have banned for now ChatGPT, GPT-4, Bard, and some of these other, Gen AI programs. But if we're saying use that in your job, we're saying, I'm asking you to disrupt your own job. Now, for some people, they find that very exciting. I love change. They'll be kind of like, oh, let me try this. For other people, that in and of itself is a hugely challenging proposition. And I'm going to be scared, that I think I just posted something yesterday. The number of people who are FOBO, fear of becoming obsolete, I think I posted it was like 40% or was it that high?
40%.
I hope not.
A big number.
Yes. I mean, I actually forget what the number was, but I just posted it yesterday. But we need to be helping people do their best work in a challenging, changing environment. And so I think that is where we can sort of bring some of the stress down and get people to sort of focus in on some of these changes, which are going to be very meaningful and helping people, excel and find out a lot more about themselves. And we're also asking people to find out, to identify their skills. And okay, Jeff, I'm going to ask you, what are your top 3 skills? I'm not going to ask for 5, just 3.
I can tell you the one I need to work on is audition. Research probably is one of my best skills, my top skills. Making people feel comfortable to tell a good story. I think I'm pretty good at that. I'm actually pretty good at, I'll give myself, since I'm lacking in audition, I'll give myself credit for Premiere, which not a lot of people can wrestle that one. So I'll give myself Adobe Premiere skills. But it's interesting on the reskill, because we don't even know the skills that we're going to need tomorrow, right? That's just so bizarre. And then where does that fit with higher education? Here's a big one.
Yes. And I mean, I ask people quite often, what are your top 3 or 5 skills? And most people don't know, but we need to be thinking about ourselves in terms of our skills. And when we're talking about our skills, then be asking, and talking to our kids in terms of what are you good at, and how to discover their top skills. And then they can sort of look and try and find and explore other skills as well. And when they're coming into, new working environments and sort of exploring what they're doing. I mean, you will find that Gen Zs are typically really, really eager to learn. That is one of the ways that they can stay competitive, that they can have the most financial stability. But we really do need to be starting to talk about ourselves in terms of a job title, but instead in terms of our skills and what we can do, because those are what we can use in all different types of ways, depending on what technology evolves and what that means that we're going to be doing and what this technology, that's going to take. I don't have to be doing that. What can I do instead over here instead?
That probably confuses people, right? They probably say, I have my title, I have my role, I have my sheepskin, but and none of the skills that I mentioned were ones that were taught in any of the expensive schooling that I've had.
Right. I mean, the great thing is in future is that AI and Gen AI, from what I understand, is really going to enable one-on-one, absolutely dedicated education. So it's sort of like, so I want to learn French. Okay, Sophie, well, what I can hear is that you're great at the future tense, but you're not very good on the past tense. Let me, tweak. Here we go. Here's, I'm delivering this lesson for you. So that's going to be incredibly powerful, going to help me learn French very quickly, or math or whatever, understanding the strategies that work for me and the strategies that don't work for me. That's going to be fantastic. We're not there yet, but those are some of the individualized sort of the powerful capabilities that AI will be able to give us on an individualized basis. So that, I think, is incredibly, when education has been has not been updated for a long time, and there's a huge gap between as to say, some of the public education systems and private, that this kind of technology will be able to change the game, and give us some of the skills that give students some of the skills that they need going into the companies as they go. And with that, and I think there's going to be a lot more collaboration between corporations and colleges and high schools to make sure that the skills are aligned, and we're teaching some of the things that people need to know. I mean, the fact that we've never taught people like budgeting and how to use a spreadsheet,
right?
It's kind of crazy, right?
Right. Well, the other piece, again, the opposite of that you've talked about in a number of your shows, is the kind of the rise of the generalist, because as the skills are changing so fast from beneath us, and the skills you learn today might not be worth much tomorrow because that technology might go away or be surpassed, the role of generalist thinking, the role of critical thinking, the role of decision making, being a little bit more thoughtful and checking references and looking for patterns, is now actually turning out to be a more valued skill than it was before. It's kind of this super generalist, if you will.
Yeah, I think the T, people talk about the T, like, having a lot of generalist and then being able to go deep in one area, or maybe a few areas or related areas. Because I think the transferable skill thing is going to be very important, and specialists are also going to be important, which goes to the individual contributor aspect that we were talking about in terms of enabling people to go go very deep. And really get specialized without sort of limiting their ability to advance, and also trying to make sure that they then don't become completely obsolete, but trying to understand what their skills are that can be applicable elsewhere. Corporations really need to be thinking about what the skills, it's called the automation potential for different people's jobs. When we come into sort of like a machinist, a machine operator, I think it has a 71% automation potential. However, there are other jobs like a lab technician, which I think there was something like a 58% match with a machine operator, but that job has a much, much lower automation potential. So how can we identify what skills people have, what the automation potential is for their job, and what other jobs at that organization or in other organizations might they be able to move to and have sort of a more secure future, and have a sort of game plan to move them from one place to from one job to another.
Right. Although most of those jobs don't exist today. I mean, web developer didn't exist 20 years ago. There wasn't such a thing, right? And an SEO expert, there wasn't such a thing. And a data broker, there wasn't such a thing. Well, I guess those have always been around.
There are, but there are ones that we do know that are there now,
right,
that people can transition to, and then yes, that's not necessarily going to be static, and there's going to be another one after that.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. But what is your take on higher education? I mean, higher education. I had a great interview one time. Was the original colleges were put together at a time when all the information on any topic could be contained in a single building. Like literally, all the books that were written and all the top
Wow.
brains could literally be in a place in Cambridge somewhere. And that's how they were designed. And that's, clearly not the case anymore. Nobody goes to libraries for books anymore. They go for the internet because then they can get all the world's information. Do you see some movements? Do you see, kind of how education can start to move to become less of kind of the traditional patterns and more of kind of continuous learning and supporting continuous learning, and kind of rethinking the way that we need to always be. We need to be curious. We need to stay learning, and maybe that taking an 18-year-old kid who's not quite ready and then sticking them in there for 4 years. I think there's some new models that need to get tried.
My son just finished university, and so it's not that I am not for actually it was a three years. He was at university in Italy, but it is tough to have any education that's going to be still be valid 3 years on or 4 years on. And so I think it really depends how that is being taught and what is being taught. And if we're talking about critical reasoning and problem solving and the essence of that, I mean, in England, you get very, very focused on one subject, but the point about that at university in England, what they say is that you're learning how to think, and it's not about the subject. I learned Chinese,
You're way ahead of your time.
I mean, and very, very interesting poetry, philosophy, history, culture, but what it was really doing was teaching me how to think. And so now I think college may well be 2 years, with maybe a third year, which is a sort of work study program. I think there's going to be a lot more collaboration, as I said earlier, with corporations, not in a in a way that's sort of over influencing what's being taught. But I think the relevance and really helping people understand, when we're moving so fast, what technologies are going to be important and what skills are going to be important, because it is hard for academia. It's a very different type of system to stay on top of it and be really able to provide the types of skills that are needed. At the same time, you have things like edX, you have Udemy, you have these big MOOCs, these massive open online courses, which allow people to be doing the courses that they need to have certifications. I know that edX, I interviewed the CEO of that a couple of years ago, and he was talking about the fact they have these micro masters. So you could do a master's program in 4 pieces. Each one took, I think, 3 months. So you could take longer. And by the end of it, you could have a master's program. You could do that whilst you were working. The many different things that you could be doing. So I think there are so many more options for people to be able to be upskilling. That's in addition, obviously, to much more training that needs to be happening in the workplace. But I do see that we're really needing to try and prepare people better when it comes to high school and the types of things that we're thinking about, and how self-directed and self-guided people need to, that young students need to be. They're not going to be going into a job and be ready for the type of ongoing changes and the different things they need to be thinking about. And all these jobs that haven't existed yet. I mean, that you could, you could come out of college and be sort of done with your education, so to speak. You'd learn on the job slowly, and you knew what the pathways were. There was a set number of pathways, and that was it. Now, when people are coming in a few years into their first, second jobs, there's an extraordinary number of jobs that they know are going to be popping up out of nowhere over the next few years. So should they make a choice about their career? How do they decide what next? Best build up some skills and then see what's going on, in 2 years' time with a few more skills. I mean, it's a very different environment. I find it very exciting, but I think what I find is also, many young sort of career employees can find it very confusing. It's like, I don't know, how do I choose?
Right. And especially when their bosses or their bosses had a more complete picture and a more kind of formulaic road to follow. Go do this, then go do this, and go do this, and 25 years you'll be a partner, right? And their parents before them. Absolutely. It's a completely different thing. I think it's important to tie it up for the listeners that, it's so important in such a hyper-competitive world that you need to get the contributions from everyone. And the only way to get contributions from everyone is for them to have that psychological safety, to take risks. And that's where you find the innovation. By rule, they all won't work, right? If you're not pushing the envelope, if everything's working, then you're not pushing the envelope very hard. You're not really taking risks. So I think that's really the big lesson, because you can't just operate with your top 10% of your talent anymore. It's just way too competitive of a world.
Yes, exactly. And I think it makes it challenging for companies, because for the longest time they have been set up to really focus on that top 10%. And then the bulk, the sort of the majority of talent didn't need to be sort of guided in their careers, because they would keep going up that sort of vertical ladder. That doesn't exist anymore. So now you have enormous number of people, particularly obviously in a large organization, who are going to have these different career paths, and how do you manage that? And companies aren't set up for that yet. So we're in a there are so many things that are changing at the moment that sometimes I feel like sort of not over blowing my own mind, but overwhelming people. But there is a lot of change. This is a period of enormous change. And so the more that we can work together at an organization, not pretend that we have all the answers, but really be collaborating, be leaning in, be empathizing, to all try and work out what the best road forward is for the particular business, whatever that means, and noticing that our customers' behaviors are changing in the products and service, or how we have to deliver them or distribute them. And I think there is a lot at play here. And if we rely just on the top 10% of talent, it would be very difficult.
Right. Well, Sophie, you're doing your part, writing books, teaching LinkedIn lessons, doing podcasts, doing lectures. My goodness, you're doing a great job of educating. And again, back to our distribution, you couldn't do that before, right? You could just throw out
Right.
a YouTube video and do a podcast, so it's really exciting and scary, which I guess is always the case, kind of regardless of the topic that you're talking about. If it's got one, it's usually got the other.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, somebody put it it was a really nice talk. Said, like, I'm scared, but if I'm scared, it tells me that I'm doing something new. And that's kind of exciting.
Right.
So,
And you're awake and alive. Well, Sophie, this has been a great conversation. I'm so glad that we got connected, and look forward to more after this, I'm sure.
definitely, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation.
All
Really
right.
appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Geez, Sophie, I'm Jeff. Thanks for listening to another episode of Work 20XX. See you next time. Take care. That was great.
Very, very glad to hear that.